Peace and justice are crucial to a stable and flourishing world. To this end, strong institutions and partnerships, for instance between major organizations and government bodies, ensure that we can all work together for a thrivable future. That's why we've invited experts on these fields to discuss how thrivable policies can guide us all to a peaceful and prosperous world for everyone. They are Ashish Kothari, involved in several non-governmental organizations, including as a Facilitation Team Member for the Global Tapestry of Alternatives, and Dr. Richard Denton, who has been associated with numerous organizations, including the Rotary Action Group for Peace and International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War. After their presentations, they kindly took questions from the audience.
Thank you to both of our speakers, Dr. Richard Denton and Mr. Ashish Kothari. Thank you for very illuminating presentations onto such important topics. To begin with, I'll start with a generic question for both of you, so both of you can, anyone can go first if you like. There is significant influence upon governments by different corporate actors, even different geopolitical interests of some nations, whether this be by arms companies or oil companies or similar extractive industries, which of course affect things like the global commons globally, different regional areas, whether they be indigenous communities and so forth. Many Western governments simply toe the lines of these interests. Just wondering, just speaking to some of the points that you made, what are some of the best strategies to combat this globally? Either of you could go first. Whoever would like to go first?
Well, just comment on that. I'm in Canada, and we, as a nation, typically follow the United States. There's probably about 40 umbrella countries that, again, follow the United States. It's interesting, though, that, again, the United States is becoming more isolationist. They just released a foreign policy a couple of Fridays ago, which states that the United States is going to focus on the Americas and leave the rest of the world to look after themselves. But again, I think it is organizations of grassroots that are actually going to make the difference. And as I pointed out through Moyer's 8 stages of movements, that this is what will happen. And that right now, I said, I think we're now in sort of stage 5, where a lot of people are becoming disillusioned, but actually the majority of people are going to come on side and make the changes.
Thanks. Yeah, agreeing with everything that you just said, Richard. Maybe just adding a couple of points there. There was a study in 2021, I think, or 22, which showed that indigenous resistance in North America, or Turtle Island, as they call it, was preventing, that is resistance to things like mining and, oil pipelines and so on, was preventing carbon emissions equivalent to 25% of the total annual emissions of the US and Canada. Now, that is climate action, right? In the sense that it is preventing what could be making things much worse. And of course, that is opposing some of the biggest corporations in the world and the governments that support those corporations. So one is ground resistance. That is absolutely essential. And we're seeing that in many parts of the world. The second is naming and shaming. I mean, where corporations have some of the worst possible practices around the world and have impunity. So this new movement, for instance, at ecocide, at actually naming ecocide and naming corporations that are responsible for ecocide, and actually bringing in even a global sort of treaty on that, or a global law on that, is also part of that. That could happen very locally, that you name and shame, or it could be happening globally. Shell, for instance, became extremely controversial when Nigerian activists raised all the issue of what they were doing with regard to oil and all the oil spills and so on and so forth. They even got one of the main activists killed. And so in other parts of the world, people who were being asked whether Shell should come in or not actually were saying, no, if that's what they're going to do, what they did in Nigeria is what they're going to do to us, we don't want it. And the example I gave you of the Amadiba in South Africa, they have been actually stopping and resisting shell for the last 20 years to come into their oceans, right? So naming, shaming, telling people what is the real truth behind what these corporations are doing and the governments that are supporting them. Third, creating and supporting alternatives to their products and services. The more we depend on going to supermarkets and buying the products of these companies, the more they're going to be empowered and strengthened and, of course, making profits. So how do we support local producers who can produce as good, if not better, things? How can we support open source rather than proprietary software, right? So the whole range of products and services, there are alternatives possible. Can we actually be much more responsible consumers of those products and services and not consume those which have blood on their hands, so to speak? And fourth and finally, I just saw a video yesterday which has really inspired me and given me hope of youth in Japan who are actually leading a new movement of not consuming. So they're saying, okay, one whole year of not buying anything new. Now, of course, these are people who already have adequate means, so we're not talking poor people here, but fine. But to do that in a society where the entire, for the last few decades, culture has been buy more, buy more, buy more, buy more. That's not just Japan, it's across the world, right? But especially in the industrialized. To actually have a moment where saying, we can actually live simply, more simply. We don't want more. And even what we have, we want to give away, is amazing. It's still a minority, but it's actually a movement which is saying we need to degrow, we need to reduce, we need to, exactly what I think Richard also said, right? Reduce, etc., etc. Reject, reduce, recycle. So these are four things I think that would be that are already very, very important in terms of resisting corporate actors and governments.
And I'll just jump in again, Ashish. In my own field, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons does just as you say. It does the shame and blame of the 9 nuclear countries. And here in Canada, the leader to the south of us wants to take us over. And so, without any organization, citizens are now boycotting, buying anything that's coming from the States. And Canadians typically are snowbirds that during the winter they fly to the southern United States. Now they're flying on to Mexico and other areas, again, avoiding the United States. So again, this is a grassroots movement without any organization, but individual citizens playing that role. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, thank you to both. And obviously, as you mentioned, the naming and shaming and boycotting is one aspect of doing so. It brings us to the second question, in fact, which is we do see significant examples of governments, powers that be, both censoring and adopting some authoritarian type approaches to crushing dissent with draconian protest laws, whereby people can be put in prison merely for political views. This can be whether it be protests against oil companies, other extractive industries. We've also seen it with examples regarding war, such as pro-Palestinian protests, etc. How can resistance to power and protesting against abuses of power best occur within this context?
So I think, many of the examples that we've already given, both of us, are examples where this resistance is taking place. Now, what I think is really important, most important actually, is to create larger and larger networks of solidarity for such people. Because if you're alone, it's very easy to crush you. If you're a single organization, it's very easy to shut you down. But if you're 1,000 across the world, if you're 100 across your own country or region, it is that much more difficult. It's still possible. It still happens. Governments have enormous power. Of course, corporations have enormous power. People get killed all the time. When I was in Brazil at COP30, we were hearing news of indigenous people who've been killed or injured by people who want to expand their operations into the Amazon. So that happens. But it is that much less so or less possible if you have, let's say, 30 indigenous nations, along with 100 civil society organizations in Brazil, raising their voice every time there is a threat. and pointing fingers to saying this is the company that's creating the problem, or this is the government minister that's creating the problem. So that local to global networking, to my mind, is absolutely important. Secondly, to be able to have all the tools necessary for you to be able to resist properly. It's not enough just to be out on the streets. You need the legal tools, you need the intellectual tools, you need the rigor of research behind you, you need the people power, you need all the four kinds of actors that Richard spoke about, right? It's important that we have all four of these. Just to give you quickly an example, then I'll finish. In India, one of the most successful movements of resistance against mining by a UK-based company by indigenous people succeeded because the local people were extremely well organized and kept resisting, including by just blocking the road, etc. But also because civil society organizations took up that and went all the way to the Supreme Court of India. And you had this local to national alliance of different kinds of actors, which included lawyers, it included media people, etc., and the local indigenous people, which was able to succeed, so far at least, in keeping that mining corporation out. So all of this is very important to counter what you're talking about, Michael.
Also add that film and movies are a great way of mobilizing people. Just recently, we had the movie Oppenheimer. Then there was House of Dynamite just recently. Nuremberg pointed out that what happened in Germany can happen anywhere. And certainly, again, as we're seeing now, Michael, is that authoritarian governments are developing everywhere. So that can certainly play a role in, again, strengthening public opinion against corporations. The other thing is that I was a former mayor and worked for several years to oppose Toronto, a large city to our south, shipping their garbage up to an open pit mine. And we did all kinds of nonviolent opposition, but eventually it came down to money. And you've probably heard the old adage, follow the money. And neither the proponent of sending the garbage to these pit or to the city of Toronto wanted to take the liability, which would cost millions or billions of dollars to rectify. And so it is, if you can find out where the money is and find out who the people are in power, then you can be very effective. Again, a nonviolent method that I remember as a youth was that if the chair of the company, say, owns a bank, you can have 30 people, just a small group of people, go in and open up a bank account, and then go back into the bank and close that bank account. And suddenly you've brought that bank to its knees. And it's, again, through these types of actions that, again, you as individuals can play a vital role in making change.
Great. Thanks for that. Thank you both for those answers. Kind of leads to the third question. What extent do you think the media and political communication by politicians and other actors, also within institutions, enables the continuation of the, say, industrial military complex or in the context of neocolonialism, extracting resources from developing countries? So just wondering what extent you think the media plays an actual vital part in the continuation of these abuses, I suppose you could say.
I think it's not just the military-industrial complex. It's now the military-industrial, political, educational. Universities are now doing the research for the military, and the entertainment. As I just said, most of our films are about violence and sex. So that is what really needs to change.
Yeah, agreed. I think, Mike, media has an incredibly important role at the moment, unfortunately, and especially the so-called social media is playing an extremely negative role, extremely regressive role, I would say, whether it's trying to topple regimes or change the course of elections or especially influence the minds of young people with all the advertising and everything that's happening, right? I mean, the advertising industry across the world has a bigger budget than most of the countries of the world, right? So it does absolutely enormous power. But it also then means that we can actually do counter media, like the examples that Richard gave of the films, right? So the more we're actually able to produce material that is not just intellectual, it's emotional. It's got emotional content. It's reaching people's hearts. No, I mean, if you look at, just to give one example, that image of a turtle which had a straw stuck in its nostril, one image that one photographer took in a small video, it created the millions of people who actually saw that and said, let's ban plastic straws. And that was an effective campaign, at least in some parts of the world. Now, that kind of, I'm not saying to do it in a vicarious way or to do it exploitatively, but where we're seeing those sorts of problems and then creating those images and creating the different forms of media. Now, young people who I work with tell me that people don't have the attention span anymore. So you need to create 30-second reels. So we do some of that, but I still believe that there are still some people, including many young people, who would also watch a 40-minute film or a 1.5 hour film or read a 5,000 word essay. So we need a whole range of media that can create and these sort of alternative spaces in which this media can be put out. And that's why I mentioned earlier open source. This is really important because otherwise, of course, it's all captured by Zuckerberg and gang.
Can I just jump in again? Here in North America, my neighbor to the south, their leader is trying to control the media, again, by not giving government money to various media, to universities that oppose him. And so, again, he is trying to control media through threats and actual lawsuits against media to bring them into his way of thinking. And again, certainly another example that Ashish mentioned was the napalm girl in Vietnam. That one picture, or the one picture of a baby on the beach of a migrant, of a refugee. These are very powerful photos that do change public opinion. And also, just one other thought just came to mind is that documentaries, are useful, but it's the soaps type of media where you have a storyline and people follow that storyline and it demonstrates a particular point of view. That's what actually people follow. So in Nigeria, I think it was, there was a soap that was on and talking about birth control and how that had a much more impact on getting people to use birth control to avoid AIDS than the documentaries on those topics.
Okay, great. Thanks for that. Just a change of topic now, and just a specific question for Mr. Ashish. And maybe we can come back to the media questions again because there's a few connected to that. But you mentioned, Ashish, the flower of transformation and 5 spheres of systemic alternatives and radical democracy. To what extent do you think these could influence the macro approaches that can be quite flawed at that macro political level in terms of accountability, in terms of a government accountability, representation, and what can be seen at times as acting on behalf of different corporate interests? So just wondering how the global tapestry of ideas can connect to influencing that at that macro political level.
No, thanks, Mike. So I think that just maybe 2 parts to that response. I think in the immediate, let's say the short run, trying to make these institutions more accountable by pointing out what the lack of accountability is doing. Pointing out, for instance, that your own constitutions are being violated by this lack of accountability. Pointing out that if your own policies or your own stated objectives when you say ran for elections was about creating jobs for everybody and so on, or more equality and things like that, but what you're actually doing is violating that. And then also saying, so what's wrong, but also then what we think should be the policy, should be the law, should be the accountability structures, should be the institutional structure, should be the governance structures. That's one part of it, which I would say is sort of reforms in the existing system. And that's crucial in the short run. In the long run, though, and this is something that in the Global Tapestry we really firmly believe, and which is what I said in my presentation, we do believe we need to pull down the power from the nation state to ordinary people on the ground. And that's why we say radical democracy, or what here we call Swaraj, or different things in different parts of the world, right? That the slogan, we are the government where we are. If it's an urban neighborhood in San Francisco or New Delhi, or if it's a village in central India or wherever, why should the people there not be the ones determining the budgets, determining the plans, determining what happens in their present and their future, based on also understanding their own past? Why should it be some corporator sitting somebody else, or some so-called expert bureaucrat sitting somewhere else who doesn't know anything about that local area? So, to my mind, that radicalization or the grounding of democratic political power is I would actually say that's the most important thing that needs to happen. But alone, of course, it's not enough, because it also has to happen with the economy. It has to happen with a sense of responsibility, because local people can also destroy things, of course. So it's this twin thing, that as we fight for reforms in the current system, we also fight for this much more fundamental long-term transformation in what is politics and what is democracy itself. And as I said, it's not theoretical and abstract. It is happening. It has happened in many parts of the world. It is happening more. And if we go back, I mean, if you look at David Graeber's recent book, and many others recently, in fact, anthropological research is coming up with some most fascinating stuff on how this form of radical democracy was probably the original form of governance, well before so-called Greek democracy in settlement. So can we maybe even learn from that ancient past, but of course to do it in a modern new context? Thanks.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Ashish, for that answer. And I've got now a specific question for Dr. Richard Denton. So just in discussing, as mentioned previously, the military, industrial, political lobbying, including some interfering by other countries, we also see examples of political elites in many Western countries, such as in Europe and elsewhere, promoting or supporting war, whether this be the war with Russia and Ukraine or the Israel-Palestine conflict. To what extent do you see this as a threat to peace, and what might some of the solutions be?
Again, I think it comes down to money. War is extremely profitable. Our neighbor to the south, again, is recommending the 5% of gross domestic product go to the military, which is just ridiculous. And I think, again, what we have to point out is that this is going to raise individuals' taxes. And when you start having people realize that their taxes are going up and that they're paying for something that doesn't actually affect their own survivability, that people are going to rise up against that. I think that it's global problems like the climate, like pandemics, that are actually affecting your health, and not a war over there that you have to be afraid of, and therefore spending your money to create defense. This old adage that if you want peace, prepare for war, is ridiculous. When you prepare for war, you get war. Napoleon found this. He had conquered Europe with his military. He then says, what am I to do now with my military? I've conquered Europe. So he goes off and tries to conquer Russia, which was a disaster. This is where what we have to look at is, again, as Ashish says, is all living sentinel beings. It's the plants, it's the animals, it's our planet that we have to work for mutually assured survival and not realizing that it's war. And so therefore, as I said in my speech, it's to divest. It's not to invest in the companies that make nuclear weapons and the military, the Boeings, the Northrop Grummons, the Lockheed Martin, General Dynamics. It is to put your money in things that sustain us. So health and education.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Dr. Richard Denton. Next question, specific question for Mr. Ashish. In the West, many movements, sometimes reactionary, have been born out of disenchantment, with many feeling that governments and media are disconnected from many cultural and social interests. So you mentioned the commons and preserving sovereignty and well-being and Indigenous knowledge within many developing countries. You've highlighted examples in India, in South Africa, and so forth, as well in terms of affecting government and resisting invasion, essentially, by different corporate actors. How important do you think connection to culture is in a macroeconomic context, if you're talking about Western developed countries where there may not be as much of that connection to these Indigenous cultural practices and less focus of the commons with it, as seen in the examples that you provided? So I'm just wondering to what extent culture and connection to this is relevant within developed Western secular countries.
Yeah, thanks. I think firstly, it's very important for us to understand that culture doesn't exist only in the global South. The global North also has culture. Now, those could be cultures which are regressive, but they could also be underlying that actually cultures which are very progressive, but they've got submerged, they've got hidden, they've got sort of sometimes maybe even erased by the currently dominant system. If you take, for instance, the examples I gave of the non-capitalist ways of living in Germany or working in Greece and so on, were examples where perhaps there's been protest against the capitalist way of living and so on, but perhaps there's also been a recourse to maybe more ancient ways in which they themselves were living, which was through community, through the commons. So I've seen examples and after example in European cities of conversion of privatized spaces back into the commons, where now say 40 families or 100 families are collectively doing agriculture or growing things and sharing with each other, and they're enjoying it. Now, what you're actually seeing is cultural transformation. It is, of course, material transformation, but it is also more fundamentally so cultural transformation, where people are saying, yeah, working with each other and as community is so much more enjoyable and so much more rewarding and creative and fun than just being our own individual selves and in our own houses. So to my mind, that kind of cultural transformation is not just very possible, but is happening also in the global West. And of course, there's a lot that the global North, and there's a lot that the North can actually learn from the South. The one difference that I see, and this is where there's a lot of very interesting dialogue going on between, say, the degrowth movement in Europe and movement, say, in India, which is the spiritual part of it. Now, this is something which I think the West has dug so deep into its past that it's very difficult to actually bring it back up, but it can be brought back out. Just the spiritual, by spiritual, I don't necessarily mean religious. I mean just the basic spiritual thing of how do you relate to the rest of nature? How do you relate to each other as life, as beings, right? How do you think of, it's not just I who have a soul, but perhaps the tree outside my house also has a soul. That kind of a spiritual reawakening is absolutely important also in the West. In a sense, we have a bit of an advantage because that spirituality has never gone from the global South. It has been transformed, sometimes very regressively so, but it's still there. And so it's a bit easier to actually bring that into our movements than it may be in the West. But it is happening also in the West. And if you take the example of the anti-pipeline movements in North America, where indigenous peoples were doing, if I remember correctly, the word that was being used was sacred activism. Richard, am I right? Sacred activism, which is to say that it is resisting these pipelines, but resisting it with actually every morning doing a prayer to the land, to the water, to the river, to your own ancestors, Now, the rest of North America, the non-indigenous part of North America, if it was looking at that, would say, oh yeah, this is something perhaps maybe we also grow up in our, in New York in a house and maybe just thank nature for the food that's coming onto our plate, just recreating a spiritual connection with the rest of nature and with our own neighbors. So these are all cultural transformations that are needed, and some of them are happening in the West also.
And I would just add that, again, from my peace point of view, that peace, again, begins with yourself. That if you want to convey peace in the world, you must be at peace within yourself. And again, that's part of the spiritual thing. Again, here in Canada, like in South Africa, we have had our Truth and Reconciliation. We now have holidays to celebrate the culture of our Indigenous people. And it's ironic that we've sort of come full circle, is that people without uh, Indigenous culture have learned about it and have portrayed themselves as being Indigenous people. So we've had a couple of authors that have claimed to be Indigenous when they were not. And so things have actually become almost a reverse racism, where people are trying to promote themselves and their culture that way.
Great. Yeah, thank you both for those answers. Very interesting. I just want to come to another question. Again, it may be applicable to both of you again. I'll start with Dr. Richard Denton for this question. We're talking about, obviously, both mentioned previously about the media and whether it's movies or television, and how it can be used for different purposes, some as warning against different issues, but it can also be a glorification of things like violence. So a lot of violence in Hollywood, in movies, in television, and also in social media, I think, as Ashish mentioned as well. So we see a lot of this. To what extent do you think that promoting violence can be used as a tool by some corporate interests to garner, say, support, obviously in the area of conflict for war, but even more broadly? So I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, certainly, I think this happens all the time. I think this is what we're up against, is living in a military culture. Even in my own peace movement, we often think of, we got to fight for our human rights. So we often use military terms in our own discussion. And this definitely plays a very big role. We've talked about the influence on children, on how violent TV can cause children to become more violent. I think the whole idea of the superhero, that we need someone out there to come and protect us, is what's contributing to our electing authoritarian people who then take over and become anything but democratic. So yes, having violent media promotes the military culture, and that's why, again, it's not just the military industrial, but it's the education, it's the political, and um, the entertainment industry for sure.
And just to add quickly to that, I mean, like Gandhi said long back, violence is not just about physically hitting each other or killing each other. That is obviously the most egregious part of it, the worst part of it. But it's also about your own thought processes, how you speak to people, how you relate to people and to the rest of nature. So it's really about, and again, this is a cultural, spiritual shift individually and collectively that we need, where you look at somebody not as the other that has to be competed against, fought against, or whatever, and with distrust, but in a way saying, oh, there's another human being, there's another living being. And maybe I start with trust and I start with friendship. And that creates a whole different, very, very different way of actually then creating or living society. Just to, I mean, many parts of the Himalaya, even now, small towns, villages, of course, people still don't lock their doors. You can go to places where, I mean, I've been so many times trekking and all of that, where people who don't know you at all will call you into their house and give you a tea. Imagine that happening in a big city where we're all living in our cocooned existence, and you're calling somebody out from the street and saying, come and have tea. It doesn't happen. But here it happens all the time in these societies. People don't lock their doors. People go and borrow things from each other without, saying, oh, you're stealing from me. That is a culture of nonviolence and peace and harmony, which we have destroyed in our industrialized society. So how do we bring that back? So nonviolence in that sense goes very, very deep beyond the physical aspects also.
I think, again, we have to get rid of nationalism, which says that my country is better than your country. I think patriotism is okay, saying that my country is great. But I think, again, we need to realize the oneness of humanity. And as Ashish points out, when we look at another person, we need to first make that connection that they are similar to us with their wants and likes. They want a healthy family. They want to be educated. They want a job, a roof over their head. We all have the same needs, Maslow's hierarchy of motives, but it's also building relationships. And as Ashish says, it's creating that trust that is important.
Great. Yeah, thank you to both of you for those answers. And it actually brings us to the next question, which is I'll start with for Mr. Ashish again. You mentioned about the concept of global governance and the issue with political boundaries, as Dr. Denton just mentioned about the nation state or nationalism, and how political boundaries could look beyond this in terms of going beyond the nation state, reimagining political boundaries through cultural flows, etc., and global governance. I'm just wondering what the best avenues for achieving this could be, and what some of the challenges to this, the most pressing challenges to this would be.
So I think if one looks at the examples of where this is beginning to happen, these are examples where people are saying the fact that a river has been broken into 3 nation states or 2 nation states is enabling the exploitation of that river beyond its sustainability limits, but also it's enabling a few people to capture the benefits of the river and not allow people downstream or the country downstream to actually get those benefits. You actually start pointing out how nation states have created the possibilities of greater conflict, the reduction of the possibilities of people and nature thriving, created this, the nation state, along with, of course, sort of global capitalism, has created this intense feelings of competition and hostility, and exactly what Richard just said about a very hyper patriotic kind of thing of my nation has to conquer every other nation kind of thing, or that every other nation is up to grab me, so I need to be able to protect myself with 5% military spending. One has to actually start challenging that, showing what the problems are because of that. And showing, for instance, in COP30, one of the things that People Summit was saying was that why is it that we've had 30 conferences of party and still not solved the climate crisis? It's because the decisions are being taken by nation states who are intensely competitive and hostile and will not take those actions individually or collectively. If it was the peoples of the world, we might have a very different way of looking at it, right? So trying to break those boundaries. An example that is right now coming up, which is very interesting to look at, is something called the Amazon Sacred Headwaters Initiative, where 30 indigenous nations in Peru and Ecuador have said, we don't recognize the Peruvian-Ecuadorian border. It's not something we created. We want 30 million hectares of the Amazon to be governed by us without thinking of that as a political border. How far it goes, of course, is a whole huge question mark, because both Peru and Ecuador want to do mining there and all of that. All the corporate interests are there. So it's going to face the challenge. So you asked, the second point was, what's the challenge? The challenge is exactly this. Nation states, there's a deep set, not just political, economic, but also deep set cultural thing that for me, India is the most important thing. I don't care what happens to Pakistan. I don't care what happens to Bangladesh. I don't care what happens to Nepal. And if anything, they're all enemies, and I need to. That kind of a cultural mindset is one of the biggest challenges. And the second one, of course, is the political and economic might that nation states have behind them. So, will these 30 indigenous nations succeed in creating that 30 million hectares of non-nation state bioregion? I don't know. But at least that thinking is there, and people are trying to kind of work through what that would mean. We need to be able to support that much more. And just to add to that, people in this generation, or maybe all the generations in the last few decades, think that there's something natural about the boundaries of the United States or the boundaries of India. And there isn't. The nation state is only 150 years old as a concept, or 200 at the most, right? And many, or probably most of the nation states across the global south have been created by colonial sleight of hand. 3 or 5 people sat somewhere in Europe and made the boundaries that define Africa today. South Asia was created because of the colonial division that happened, right? Parts of it. So that history needs to be brought back into people's consciousness. There is nothing natural about the political boundaries today. It is because of colonial history across most of the world that this has happened. I think parts of Europe also. So that, bring that back and say that what happened, what was there before that? We just did a report. Sorry, this answer has become a bit long. We just did a report last year on pre-British India and how people were defining the boundaries. And those boundaries were defined by culture and nature, much more than anything else. So we've mapped that, and then we've mapped that and we've superimposed it on today's political boundaries and said, here's what the difference is, and here's what the difference is causing, the problems that this is causing, right? So we need to do much more of that. Indigenous peoples are remapping themselves. They're doing counter mapping, saying this is our boundaries. These are our boundaries, and we define them by rivers and mountains and cultural connections, not the way you guys have done it.
Think of the image of the globe, our planet as seen from outer space. No boundaries.
Yeah. Yeah, good points. All right, thank you for that answer there. I will just come to Richard Denton again, just for a specific question. You mentioned the environmental impact of war, so obviously we're talking about conflict and the environmental impact of that. Many reasons for war linked to different extractive industries and ownership of resources. Just wondering, what do you see as some of the biggest environmental threats connected to geopolitical disputes?
Thank you again for that great question. This is my whole sort of thesis, is that the military and the environment are connected together. The military is a greatest user as an institution of fossil fuels and a great producer of greenhouse gases, where it is destroying the environment, whether it's in Ukraine or Gaza. It's destroying where wildlife used to have its own refuge. The problems of using depleted uranium to destroy tanks, etc., that radiation persists. The Agent Oranges, the forever chemicals are in the ground. Landmine ordinances have prevented farming of arable land. So all of these come together of the military to destroy the environment. The jets that Israel was flying during the Gaza war released a tremendous amount of carbon dioxide, equal to that of some of the smaller countries. Even like Spain wasn't emitting as much carbon dioxide as the jets that were flying during the Gaza war. So has a tremendous influence.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. I'll just come to Mr. Ashish again for a specific question. You mentioned about privatization versus the commons, obviously globally. I'm just wondering, in terms of the commons, what are some of the main challenges to this?
Well, I guess one of the biggest challenges is this feeling that there's something very natural and justifiable about having private property. And again, if you look at most of history, that has not been the case. It's really colonial time onward that you actually get this thing, and the enclosure movement in UK, and then of course in across North America, where people just put stakes and said this is from now on our land, which actually used to be commons. So the notion of private property itself is the biggest challenge. And again, if you go back to that South Africa example I keep giving of the Amadiba people, they say, why are we not poor and why are we actually rich? Is because all the land is in the commons. There's no private property there at all. And that's why they're able to resist for decades any kind of external imposition, right? So the recommoning of land, property, nature not to be privatized, and ideas, even more difficult. Because again, over the last 200 years, we have actually got kind of so conditioned to thinking if I say radical ecological democracy, I have invented the term, therefore it's my idea and I should patent it, rather than saying, no, anybody can use it. Like I said in the chat to, I think, Vivian, please go ahead and use my presentation. There's no copyright on it. But making that breakthrough for a lot of people, especially in academic circles and of course in industrial circles, is very, very, very difficult. But again, private property, whether in ideas or in physical things, land and so on, is not the normal for most of human history. For most of human history, it's been the commons. And so we can bring it back, and it is coming back in many forms, like the examples I gave.
Great, thank you for that. Just bring it back to the media question again. To what extent do you think that political polarization, as often inflamed by the media and different political communication, can detract and distract communities from some of these focuses to address and preserve social and environmental interests?
It certainly does that. I think what happened in COVID, a pandemic, we became very isolated. We are locked into our own little silos. The algorithms of social media feed us what we want to hear, and so we don't hear the other points of view. We have become very isolated not only as individuals and as the United States is becoming right now. And we need to have that broader viewpoint to and so one of the great educators is travel. When you travel around the world, and I've been very fortunate to do that to over 100 countries, is that again you see different cultures that we talked about earlier, um, and how that enriches us. Uh, Historically, here in Canada, we used to refer to people as the hyphenated Canadian, so that you're an Irish Canadian, you're a Polish Canadian, you're an Italian Canadian, an Indian Canadian, whatever. And so that the cultures could be maintained. So I think that we need to get back to a much broader view to get away from that polarization. And again, this is the problem, as I said earlier, with nationalism. It's you become to think that my country is the best country in the world. Years ago, I visited the Soviet Union at that time, and here in the West, we thought Gorbachev was great. But when I talked with local Soviets at that time, they hated Gorbachev because he brought in perestroika. And prior to that time, they thought the Soviet Union was great. There was no problems. And suddenly, with the freedom of information, they found out that yes, there was accidents in the mining industry. There was trail derailments. Yes, planes crashed. And suddenly they thought, my gosh, maybe the Soviet Union isn't so great after all. So we need to have that open communication and to break down the silos and to realize that we are all one species. We have that unity of us all.
Yeah, so Mike, I mean, let me give you an example just to respond to your question. Just last week, there was there's been news about New Delhi having the worst air pollution levels in the world. It's at the severe level, extremely bad. But then there was an incident in the Indian Parliament where one of the opposition party politicians was found smoking in the Parliament, which is not allowed. That became a full day of news because the ruling party picked it up and said, see how irresponsible the opposition is. So pollution was thrown completely out of the, I mean, not even forget the politicians, not even the media was picking it up. And completely irrelevant issue became a full day of news, right? So political polarization, which is dumbing down debate, which is where it's slanging matches rather than serious dialogue on issues, right? Where you can have difference of opinion, but it's still a serious dialogue on issues like poverty and pollution and inequality and war and environment, right? It only remains slanging matches. Whether it's Trump versus Biden or it's Modi versus Rahul Gandhi or whoever, wherever you are. So, and that, of course, detracts us, it detracts the media, it detracts communities, it detracts people from real issues. And this is where, to my mind, Western liberal democracy has inherent flaws. It is inherently problematic because it is dependent on this kind of competition, this kind of pulling each other down, this kind of hostility, right? It is dependent on that. It is inevitably not democratic to my mind, and which is why we keep talking about needing different forms of governance and democracy, which I spoke about earlier. That's the only way you're going to get out of this political polarization and get people to come back to track on what the real serious issues are.
Okay, great. Thank you to both. We've come up to time now, so I'll just say, yeah, thank you for a very interesting discussion, Mr. Ashish Kothari and Dr. Richard Denton. It was a very interesting and illuminating discussion. We do have further questions which will be posted online, so any questions that weren't able to be asked today due to the time restriction will be posted, and you'll have the opportunity to ask online after this event. So thank you again to you both.